James was finally going to get the phone call he'd been waiting for his entire life. Then, the windshield had spiderwebbed into 1,000 pieces, each one reflecting a different version of my 66-year-old face. And somewhere in the distance, sirens were screaming toward what was left of my Mercedes and the telephone pole that had jumped right into my path. At least that's how I'd tell it when I got the chance. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up kissing a telephone pole on Highway 34 with $33 million in my purse and my son's number burning a hole in my phone. It all started 3 weeks ago when my lawyer called with news that would have knocked me off my feet if I hadn't already been sitting down with a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour earlier. "Mrs. Thompson," Harrison Burke had said in that careful way lawyers speak when they're about to change your life, "I'm calling about your great-aunt Ruth's estate." Now Aunt Ruth had been 91 years old and meaner than a wet cat for the last 30 of those years. She'd lived alone in that enormous house in Connecticut, collecting vintage jewelry and grudges in equal measure. The family joke was that she'd outlive us all out of pure spite. But apparently even spite has its limits, because she'd passed away peacefully in her sleep the week before Christmas. "I'm sorry for your loss," Harrison continued, "but I need you to come to my office. There are some significant developments regarding her will." The thing about getting a call like that at my age is you've learned to expect disappointment. Ruth had never been particularly fond of any of us, and she'd made it clear over the years that she thought the Thompson family tree had produced nothing but lazy branches. So when I drove to Harrison's office that frigid January morning, I was prepared to inherit maybe a piece of Ruth's china or one of her acid-tongue lectures from beyond the grave. What I wasn't prepared for was Harrison sliding a document across his mahogany desk and watching my face as I read the numbers. $33 million, properties in 3 states, investment portfolios that read like a who's who of American business. All of it left to my dear great-niece Margaret, the only one who never asked me for anything. The irony wasn't lost on me. In a family of hands constantly stretched out toward Ruth's purse, I'd been the only one who'd kept my distance, and apparently that had been exactly the right strategy. She left letters for each family member, Harrison had explained, pulling out a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Ruth's spidery handwriting. "Yours is particularly detailed." I'd read that letter 3 times before the full meaning hit me. Ruth had been watching all of us for years, taking notes, making judgments, and she'd seen things about my son James that I'd been too much of a mother to admit. "James has his father's charm and his grandfather's greed," she'd written. "Margaret, you raised him to expect the world to hand him everything on a silver platter, and now he's a 42-year-old man who still thinks success is something that happens to other people. Don't let him waste what I've built." That should have been my first warning. But maternal blindness is a condition that affects women of all ages, and I was no exception. 3 weeks later, sitting in my car outside James's office building with a manila envelope containing bank statements that would change both our lives, I was still thinking about how proud he'd be, how this would finally give him the security he'd been looking for. The last thing I remembered before the crash was James's secretary telling me he was in a meeting and couldn't be disturbed. I'd been pulling back into traffic, imagining the look on his face when I told him the news, when a delivery truck ran a red light and sent both of us into a dance that ended with me French-kissing a utility pole. Now here I was, 3 days later, staring at a hospital ceiling that had brown water stains shaped like countries I'd never visited, listening to the steady beep of machines that were apparently keeping me alive. My left arm was in a cast. My head felt like it had been used for batting practice. And every time I breathed, my ribs reminded me why sudden stops were bad for people our age. The worst part wasn't the pain, though. The worst part was that I'd called James the moment I woke up, and this is what he'd said. "Mom, I don't have time for this kind of thing right now. I'm in the middle of closing the biggest deal of my career, and I can't just drop everything because you had a fender bender." A fender bender. That's what he called the accident that had left me looking like I'd gone 10 rounds with a professional boxer. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom at 66. Sometimes it gives you the perfect angle to see exactly what kind of foundation you've been building your life on. That was Tuesday. Today was Friday, and James still hadn't come to see if I was breathing. But I'd gotten something better than a visit from my ungrateful son. I'd gotten clarity, and clarity at my age was more valuable than all of Aunt Ruth's millions. Well, almost. The nurses here at Riverside General have been trying to cheer me up by telling me how lucky I am to be alive, which is exactly the kind of toxic positivity I'd expect from people who spend their days watching other people die. Lucky, right. Because nothing says good fortune like discovering your only child has the emotional depth of a puddle and the loyalty of a campaign promise. I'd been Margaret Thompson, devoted mother and widow, for so long that I'd forgotten I used to be Margaret Sullivan, the girl who'd talked her way into college with a partial scholarship and enough determination to power a small city. Somewhere along the way, I'd traded in my backbone for a maternal instinct that had apparently been working overtime for the last 42 years. Let me tell you about James, my pride and joy, my reason for living, my biggest disappointment wrapped up in a 6-foot frame with his father's blue eyes and my stubborn chin. He'd been the kind of baby that made other women stop me in the grocery store to coo over his perfect features, and I'd spent the next 4 decades waiting for his personality to catch up to his appearance. James graduated from college with a business degree and enough student loans to buy a house, then spent the next 20 years jumping from job to job like a man with commitment issues and a trust fund. The problem was, there was no trust fund, just a mother who kept bailing him out every time his latest get-rich-quick scheme crashed and burned. There was the year he decided to become a real estate investor, with no money and less sense. 6 months later, I was writing a check to save him from bankruptcy. Then came his restaurant phase, because apparently watching cooking shows made him think he understood the food industry. That disaster cost me my vacation fund and his marriage to a perfectly nice woman named Jennifer who wisely ran for the hills. The pattern was always the same. James would get excited about something new, convince himself he was meant for greatness, dive in head first, and then call me when the water got too deep. And like the fool I was, I kept throwing him life preservers instead of swimming lessons. Which brings me to Emily Walker, the mysterious woman who'd become Mrs. James Thompson 3 months ago in what he'd described as a small, intimate ceremony that was so intimate it didn't include his mother. I'd found out about the wedding from a Facebook post, which tells you everything you need to know about our relationship these days. Emily was 38 years old, worked in marketing, and had the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes in photographs. I'd met her exactly once, at a strained dinner where she'd spent the entire evening asking pointed questions about my financial situation while pretending to be interested in my quilting hobby. "Mrs. Thompson," she'd said, leaning forward with that plastic smile, "James tells me you're thinking about downsizing. That's so smart at your age. Have you considered what you'll do with all the equity from your house? Now, I may be old, but I wasn't born yesterday. When a woman starts talking about your equity on the first meeting, she's not interested in becoming your daughter-in-law. She's interested in becoming your heir." But I'd kept my mouth shut because James had seemed happy. And after Jennifer had left him, I'd been worried he'd end up alone. Now, lying here with machines beeping my vital signs to an empty room, I was beginning to think alone might have been an improvement. The door opened, and Dr. Sarah Martinez walked in with the kind of purposeful stride that told me she had news that wasn't going to make my day any better. "Mrs. Thompson, how are you feeling today?" "Like I've been hit by a truck, which is ironic since it was actually a truck that hit me." She smiled at that, the kind of real smile that told me she appreciated a patient who wasn't wallowing in self-pity. "Your CT scan results came back. The good news is there's no additional brain damage beyond what we initially found. The bad news is you're going to be here for at least another week while we monitor your recovery." Another week in this place. Another week of James having every opportunity to visit and choosing not to. Another week of Emily Walker pretending she cared about my well-being while calculating how long she'd have to wait for me to die naturally. "Doctor, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "In your experience, how often do adult children actually visit their parents in the hospital?" "Doctor." Martinez sat down in the plastic chair next to my bed, which told me she was settling in for a conversation, not a quick medical update. "Are we talking about your son?" "We're talking about family dynamics and whether I've been fooling myself for the last 4 decades. She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Mrs. Thompson, I see a lot of families in crisis situations. What I've learned is that emergencies don't create character flaws, they reveal them. That hit me like a second truck. So you're saying James has always been selfish, and I've just been making excuses for him? I'm saying that people show you who they are when the stakes are highest. The question isn't whether James should be here. The question is what you're going to do with the information his absence is giving you. After she left, I pulled out my phone and stared at James's contact information. I could call him again, could guilt him into visiting, could play the dying mother card until he showed up with flowers and apologies, or I could accept that Dr. Martinez was right, and this was who my son really was when nobody was forcing him to pretend otherwise. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize, and a voicemail that had come in while I was having my CT scan. I played it back, and a woman's voice filled the small room. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Carla Stevens from Riverside Trust and Estate Planning. I'm calling about the inheritance documents you were carrying during your accident. They were recovered from your vehicle, and there are some irregularities that need your immediate attention. Please call me back as soon as you're able." Irregularities. That was never a word you wanted to hear from someone handling millions of dollars of your money. But it was about to get a lot more irregular, because I was about to find out exactly how far my son was willing to go to get his hands on Aunt Ruth's fortune. Carla Stevens had the kind of voice that suggested she'd spent her career delivering bad news to people who thought they were having good days. When I called her back from my hospital bed, she got straight to the point in a way I was beginning to appreciate from the professional women in my life. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask you some sensitive questions about your family situation." "Ask away." At this point, sensitive is relative. "Have you told anyone about your inheritance?" The question hit me like ice water. "Just my son. I was actually on my way to tell him when the accident happened." "Why?" Silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough to make my heart rate monitor start beeping faster. "Mrs. Thompson, someone has been making inquiries about your great-aunt's estate. Specifically, they've been asking about the probate timeline and when the funds would be available for distribution." My mouth went dry. "What kind of inquiries?" "The kind that suggests someone is very interested in your financial situation and has been doing research. I wouldn't normally be concerned, but the inquiry started 3 weeks before your aunt's death was even announced in the obituaries." I closed my eyes and tried to process what she was telling me. Someone had known about Ruth's death and her will before I did. Someone had been planning for this inheritance before Ruth was even in the ground. "Mrs. Thompson, I hate to ask this, but have you recently updated any insurance policies, wills, or beneficiary information?" The room started spinning. And it had nothing to do with my head injury. "No, I haven't changed anything in years. My son is still my primary beneficiary on everything. I think you need to consider making some changes. Soon." After I hung up, I sat there staring at the water-stained ceiling and trying to figure out how my life had become the kind of family drama they made Lifetime movies about. Either I was being paranoid, or my son and his new wife had been planning their inheritance strategy before I even knew there was an inheritance to plan for. The knock on my door interrupted my spiral into maternal disappointment. A young nurse I hadn't seen before poked her head in. She was maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of bright eyes that suggested she actually enjoyed her job. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Nicole, and I'll be covering for Sandra this weekend. How are you feeling?" "Like I'm living in a soap opera where I'm the only character who doesn't know the plot." Nicole laughed. A real laugh that made me like her immediately. "That sounds about right for a Friday afternoon in the hospital. Mind if I check your vitals?" As she worked, I found myself studying her face. There was something familiar about her features, something that nagged at the edge of my memory like a word on the tip of your tongue. "Nicole, have we met before? You look familiar." She paused in taking my blood pressure, and I caught a flicker of something in her expression. Recognition? Nervousness? "I don't think so, Mrs. Thompson. I just started working here this week." "What made you choose nursing?" My grandmother was a nurse. She always said it was the kind of job where you could make a real difference in people's lives. She finished with the blood pressure cuff and made notes on my chart. She used to tell me stories about her patients, how sometimes the families were harder to deal with than the medical problems. Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. "What kind of family problems?" Nicole sat down in the chair Dr. Martinez had vacated earlier, which seemed to be becoming the unofficial confession booth of room 314. Adult children who only show up when they think there's money involved. Families who fight over inheritances before the patient is even gone. People who use medical emergencies as opportunities instead of wake-up calls. I was starting to understand why she looked familiar. Not because I'd met her before, but because she had the same expression I'd been wearing since Tuesday. The look of someone who'd figured out that the people closest to them weren't quite who they'd pretended to be. Nicole, can I ask you something personal? Sure. Have you ever had to choose between what you want to believe about someone and what the evidence is telling you? She was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was soft. Every day, Mrs. Thompson. Every single day. After she left, I called Harrison Burke, my lawyer, and asked him to come to the hospital. If Carla Stevens was right, and someone had been making inquiries about Ruth's estate before her death was public, I needed to know exactly what kind of legal protection I had. More importantly, I needed to know what kind of legal exposure James might have created for himself. Harrison arrived 2 hours later with his usual leather briefcase and his worried expression that told me he'd been doing research since my call. Margaret, we need to talk about some things that might be difficult to hear. Harrison, at this point, difficult is my middle name. Hit me with your worst. He pulled out a folder and set it on the hospital table. I've been looking into the inquiries about Ruth's estate. They came from a law firm in the city that specializes in estate planning and asset protection. Asset protection from what? From creditors? From tax obligations? From family disputes? He opened the folder and showed me a business card. The attorney who made the inquiries is named Kevin Hayes. Does that name mean anything to you? I studied the card, and my blood pressure started climbing again. Kevin Hayes, Hayes and Associates, Estate Planning and Asset Protection. I'd never heard the name before, but I'd heard the law firm mentioned recently. Harrison, James mentioned he was working with a new lawyer about some business venture. He said the attorney specialized in investment protection. Margaret, Kevin Hayes doesn't handle business law. He handles family wealth management and inheritance disputes. His specialty is helping people maximize their inheritance potential and minimize their tax exposure. The pieces started clicking into place like a jigsaw puzzle assembled by someone with very steady hands and very questionable morals. James hadn't been planning a business venture. He'd been planning for my death, and he'd hired an attorney to make sure he got every penny of Ruth's $33 million. But here's the thing about being 66 years old and lying in a hospital bed while your only child plots your financial demise. It gives you a unique perspective on what really matters in life. And what mattered to me right now wasn't the money or even the betrayal. What mattered was that I was about to show my son exactly what happened when you mistake your mother for a doormat. Because if James thought he could inherit Ruth's fortune by wishing me into an early grave, he was about to learn that the Thompson family tree had produced at least one branch with more fight than he'd bargained for. But first, I was going to find out exactly who else was involved in this little conspiracy, starting with his new wife and her very convenient marriage to a man whose mother had just become inconveniently wealthy. Sunday morning brought coffee that tasted like someone had dissolved a tire in hot water and a visit from Emily Walker Thompson that I definitely hadn't asked for. She swept into my room wearing a black dress that screamed funeral appropriate and carrying flowers that were probably from the hospital gift shop downstairs. The smile she'd painted on her face was the same one she'd worn to our awkward dinner. But this time, I was looking at it with new eyes. Margaret, you poor thing. James has been absolutely beside himself with worry. That was interesting, considering James had been too beside himself to actually visit, call back, or apparently notice that his mother had been in the hospital for 5 days. But I'd learned something important about dealing with people like Emily. Sometimes the best strategy was to let them hang themselves with their own rope. Emily, how thoughtful of you to come. James couldn't make it. Oh, you know how he is when he's working on something big. He's been practically living at the office, trying to get everything in order. She arranged the flowers in a plastic vase with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. He asked me to check on you and see how you're recovering. How I'm recovering from what exactly? The question seemed to catch her off guard. From your accident? James told you about the accident? Well, yes, of course he did. When it happened. I nodded slowly, because Emily had just revealed something she probably hadn't intended to. According to James, he didn't have time for this kind of thing when I'd called him from the hospital. But apparently, he'd had enough time to give Emily a detailed briefing about my condition. Emily, sit down. Let's chat. She perched on the edge of the visitor's chair like a woman ready to make a quick exit if necessary. "How are you feeling? You look much better than I expected." "I'm feeling grateful, actually. There's nothing like a near-death experience to help you see people clearly. I'm so glad you're staying positive. James was worried you might be depressed or anxious about the future." "What future would that be?" Another flash of uncertainty in those calculating eyes. "Your recovery, your health. You know, normal concerns for someone your age after a trauma like this." Someone my age. There it was again, that subtle reminder that I was old, fragile, and presumably one step away from the grave. Emily was working from the same playbook as James, but she wasn't nearly as good at hiding her true intentions. "Emily, tell me about your family. I realized I know almost nothing about your background." The smile flickered for just a moment. "Oh, you know, typical American family. Nothing too interesting." "Where did you grow up?" "Ohio. Small town. You probably wouldn't know it." "Try me. I've been to Ohio plenty of times." "Riverside." "It's just a little farming community." I filed that information away for later verification because something in Emily's voice suggested she was making up her childhood on the spot. But I was more interested in her present circumstances. "How did you and James meet?" "At a business conference. He was there representing his company. And I was there for marketing seminars. We just clicked immediately." "Which conference was that?" "It was a financial planning conference for small business owners." That was interesting, considering James had never owned a business, small or otherwise. And according to the story he told me, they'd met at a coffee shop near his office. Emily was either a compulsive liar, or she was having trouble keeping track of which version of their love story she'd told to whom. "Emily, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. What are your plans now that you're married? Are you thinking about children? Buying a house? That sort of thing?" The question seemed to relax her, as if we'd moved into safer territory. "Oh, well, James and I have talked about all of that. We'd love to have a family, but we want to make sure we're financially secure first. You know how expensive everything is these days." "Absolutely. Financial security is so important. Have you two been planning for the future? Investments, life insurance, that kind of thing?" "James has been working with a financial advisor about investment strategies. He's very focused on building wealth for our future family." "That's wonderful. What kind of investments?" Emily shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I don't really understand all the details. James handles the financial side of things." Of course he did, because in Emily's world, the little woman left the money matters to her husband, especially when those money matters involved inheriting millions of dollars from his mother. "Well, I'm sure James is making smart decisions. He's always been good with money." That was a lie so spectacular that I almost choked on it, but Emily nodded enthusiastically, apparently unaware that James's financial history resembled a controlled demolition more than strategic planning. A new voice interrupted our conversation. "Excuse me, Mrs. Thompson?" We both turned to see Nicole standing in the doorway with her clipboard, and that familiar expression I was beginning to recognize as carefully controlled tension. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to check your dressings." Emily stood up immediately, gathering her purse with the quick movements of someone eager to escape. "I should get going anyway. James will want to know how you're doing." "Emily, before you go, could you tell James I need to speak with him? It's important." "Of course, I'll let him know." After Emily left, Nicole closed the door and turned to me with an expression that was far more serious than any medical procedure required. "Mrs. Thompson, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you should be careful around that woman." "Why do you say that?" Nicole looked toward the door, as if making sure Emily was really gone. "Because I've seen her here before, and it wasn't to visit you." My heart started doing that irregular beating thing that makes hospital monitors go crazy. "What do you mean?" 3 days ago, she was at the nurse's station asking very specific questions about your condition, your treatment plan, and your expected length of stay. But when we asked her to sign the visitor log, she said she'd changed her mind and left. So Emily had been keeping tabs on me since the beginning, gathering intelligence for James while pretending to be the concerned daughter-in-law. It was beginning to look like my accident had triggered some kind of coordinated response from the happy couple. "Nicole, is there something else?" "Mrs. Thompson, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but yesterday I overheard her on the phone in the parking lot. She was talking to someone about timeline expectations and alternative scenarios if the recovery takes longer than anticipated. Alternative scenarios. That was a euphemism that made my blood run cold, because I was beginning to understand that Emily and James weren't just waiting for me to die naturally. They were making contingency plans in case I took too long to accommodate their inheritance schedule. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the woman they were trying to manipulate, and they were about to discover that surviving 66 years on this planet had taught me a few things about recognizing predators. The question now wasn't whether James and Emily were planning something. The question was how far they were willing to go, and how much evidence I could gather before they figured out that their target was fighting back. By Monday morning, I'd made a decision that would have shocked the old Margaret Thompson, but felt perfectly natural to the new version of myself that was emerging from the wreckage of my maternal illusions. I was going to investigate my own son and his wife like the potential criminals they were apparently becoming. The first step was calling Detective Maria Rodriguez, a woman I'd met at a community safety meeting last year who'd impressed me with her no-nonsense approach to elder fraud. When I explained my situation, she didn't dismiss my concerns as the paranoid fantasies of a traumatized accident victim. Mrs. Thompson, what you're describing fits a pattern we see more often than people realize. Adult children who marry quickly after a parent receives an inheritance, mysterious inquiries about estates, sudden interest in a parent's medical condition. These are red flags. What kind of red flags? The kind that suggest someone is planning to accelerate their inheritance timeline. That phrase hit me like a slap. Are you saying you think James and Emily might be planning to hurt me? I'm saying that when large amounts of money are involved, people sometimes consider options they wouldn't normally think about, especially if they believe they can make it look accidental. After I hung up, I sat there staring at my reflection in the hospital window and trying to process the fact that I was now officially worried that my own son might be planning my murder. It was the kind of realization that should have sent me into hysterical tears, but instead, I found myself getting angry. The kind of cold, calculated anger that comes from finally seeing the truth about someone you've been making excuses for your entire life. That's when Nicole appeared in my doorway with what looked suspiciously like excitement in her eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, can I talk to you about something?" "Nicole, at this point, you can talk to me about anything. Fire away." She closed the door and moved her chair closer to my bed. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about having to choose between what you want to believe about someone and what the evidence tells you. Yes, the thing is, I haven't been completely honest with you about why I look familiar. My heart started doing that irregular thing again, but this time, it felt like anticipation rather than dread. I did recognize you when I first saw you, Mrs. Thompson. Not because we'd met, but because I'd seen your picture before. Where? In Emily Walker's apartment. The room went completely silent except for the steady beeping of my monitors. Nicole had just confirmed that my suspicions about Emily weren't paranoid delusions. They were justified. "Nicole, I think you'd better explain everything." She took a deep breath like someone about to dive into deep water. "My name is Nicole Stevens, and Emily Walker isn't who she claims to be. Her real name is Emily Hayes, and she's been planning this marriage to your son for over a year?" The world tilted sideways. Emily Hayes. As in, Kevin Hayes, the lawyer who was making inquiries about Ruth's estate? Kevin Hayes is her brother. If I hadn't already been lying in a hospital bed, I would have needed one. The pieces of the puzzle weren't just clicking into place. They were slamming together like freight trains. Emily wasn't some random woman James had met at a coffee shop or a business conference. She was part of a coordinated plan involving her attorney brother and what was beginning to look like a professional inheritance scheme. "Nicole, how do you know all this?" "Because I used to date Kevin Hayes, and I've spent the last 6 months watching him destroy people's lives for money. Emily is his sister, but she's also his business partner. They specialize in targeting wealthy older adults through their adult children." "How does it work?" "Emily identifies targets through public records, recent inheritances, property transfers, estate probates. Then she arranges to meet the heir, usually through some manufactured coincidence. She's charming, attractive, and she moves fast. Most men don't realize what's happening until it's too late." I thought about James, with his history of bad decisions and his desperate need to feel successful. He would have been perfect prey for someone like Emily. What's the endgame? Nicole's expression grew darker. Usually the marriage lasts just long enough to establish inheritance rights, and then the wealthy parent dies in an accident that looks natural. Heart attack, fall, medication mix-up, things that happen to older adults all the time. And Kevin Hayes handles the legal side? He makes sure the wills are structured properly, that the inheritances transfer quickly, and that there are no legal complications. He's very good at what he does. The full scope of what I was dealing with hit me like a second truck. This wasn't just a greedy son and his calculating wife. This was a professional operation, and I was their latest target. Nicole, why are you telling me this? Because Kevin Hayes destroyed my cousin's family last year. Same pattern, same methods. But they made a mistake with your family. What mistake? They didn't research you carefully enough. They assumed you'd be like their other targets, isolated, trusting, financially naive. But you're not, and you've been asking the right questions. I looked at this young woman who'd risked her job and possibly her safety to warn me, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine gratitude for unexpected alliance. Nicole, what do you need me to do? Help me gather evidence. My cousin's family never had proof of what Kevin and Emily were planning, so they got away with it. But if we can document their pattern, build a case, we might be able to stop them. And save the next family, and save your life. That afternoon, when Emily returned for her second concerned daughter-in-law visit, I was ready for her. She brought more flowers, more fake smiles, and a carefully rehearsed concern for my emotional state. Margaret, James is so worried about you. He thinks you might be depressed about the future. Have you thought about what you'll do when you get out of here? Actually, Emily, I've been thinking about making some changes. The accident really put things in perspective for me. Her eyes brightened with what I now recognized as predatory interest. What kind of changes? Well, I've been thinking about my will, my insurance policies, things like that. You know how they say you should get your affairs in order after a medical scare. That's very wise. Margaret, have you talked to an attorney? I was thinking about it. Do you know anyone good? Someone who understands estate planning? Emily's smile became more genuine, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. Actually, James has been working with someone wonderful. Kevin Hayes. He's fantastic with family financial planning. That sounds perfect. Maybe I should set up a meeting with him? I think that's a wonderful idea. I'll have James call him today. After she left, I called Nicole and told her about the conversation. Within an hour, we'd set up a plan that would either expose Emily and Kevin Hayes for the criminals they were, or get me killed in the process. But here's the thing about being a 66-year-old woman who's just discovered that her family tree includes a branch of sociopaths. Sometimes the only way forward is through, even when through leads straight into the heart of a conspiracy designed to make you disappear. Kevin Hayes had the kind of office that screamed expensive success. Leather furniture, mahogany desk, and law books that looked like they'd never been opened, but cost a fortune to display. When James walked me in for our appointment Wednesday morning, I was using a cane and playing the part of a fragile old woman who needed guidance from strong, intelligent men. Mom, I think you're really going to like Kevin. He's helped Emily and me plan our entire financial future. Kevin Hayes was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of smooth confidence that comes from years of convincing people to trust him with their life savings. He stood up when we entered, all professional courtesy and practiced charm. Mrs. Thompson, it's such a pleasure to meet you. James has told me so much about you, and I was so sorry to hear about your accident. Thank you, Kevin. James says you're wonderful at helping families protect their wealth. That's exactly what I do. I help people ensure that their legacy is preserved and their loved ones are taken care of according to their wishes. I settled into the leather chair across from his desk. Gripping my cane with hands, I made sure to tremble slightly. I have to admit, this inheritance has me feeling overwhelmed. $33 million is more money than I ever imagined having. Kevin's eyes lit up like a man who'd just seen his Christmas bonus walking through the door. It's certainly a substantial sum, but with proper planning, we can ensure that it provides security for you and your family for generations. What kind of planning? Well, first we need to look at tax implications. Inheritances of that size can be subject to significant estate taxes if they're not structured properly. He pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. How has the money been invested currently? I gave him the details I'd memorized from Ruth's financial statements, watching him calculate percentages in his head. James sat beside me, nodding along like a man who understood investment strategy instead of someone whose longest relationship with money had lasted about 6 months. Mrs. Thompson, I'd recommend establishing a family trust that would protect these assets from taxes and potential creditors. We'd structure it so that you maintain control during your lifetime, but the assets transfer seamlessly to James upon your death. That sounds complicated. Not at all. I specialize in these arrangements. In fact, I've already prepared some preliminary documents based on what James told me about your situation. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder thick with legal papers. These are just drafts, of course, but they'll give you an idea of how we can structure everything. I accepted the papers with the grateful smile of a woman who was relieved to have someone else handle the confusing details. But as I flipped through the pages, I was actually reading carefully, looking for exactly what Nicole had warned me to expect. And there it was, buried in the legal language like a landmine in a flower garden. The trust documents weren't just designed to transfer assets to James upon my death. They were structured to make him the immediate beneficiary if I became incapacitated due to medical or mental health issues. Kevin, what does this section mean? I pointed to the relevant paragraph, letting my voice carry just a hint of confusion. Oh, that's just a standard provision to protect you if you ever develop dementia or become unable to manage your affairs. It ensures that James can step in immediately to protect your interests. Protect my interests. Right. What it actually meant was that if I had another accident or developed convenient health problems or started showing signs of mental decline, James would gain immediate access to $33 million without the inconvenience of waiting for me to die naturally. How would that be determined? The incapacity, I mean. Usually by medical evaluation. If 2 doctors agree that you're no longer competent to make financial decisions, the trust provisions would activate automatically. 2 doctors, like the kind of doctors who might be willing to diagnose convenient medical conditions in exchange for financial compensation from someone who'd recently gained access to millions of dollars. This all seems very thorough, Kevin. When would we need to finalize everything? I'd recommend moving quickly. Estate planning is most effective when it's implemented before any health issues arise. I could have final documents ready by Friday if you're comfortable proceeding. James leaned forward eagerly. Mom, I really think this is the right thing to do. It'll give you peace of mind knowing everything is taken care of. Peace of mind. From a son who hadn't visited me in the hospital and a lawyer who was planning to help him steal my inheritance by having me declared incompetent. You know what? I think I'd like to proceed. But I do have one request. Of course, Mrs. Thompson. Anything. I'd like my longtime attorney to review everything before I sign. Harrison Burke has been handling my affairs for 20 years, and I trust his judgment completely. Kevin's smile flickered for just a moment, like a candle in a sudden breeze. Of course, that's perfectly reasonable. Though I should mention that sometimes outside attorneys can complicate straightforward transactions with unnecessary concerns. I'm sure Harrison will understand that you're looking out for my best interests. After we left Kevin's office, James drove me back to my house, the first time I'd been home since the accident. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed a car parked across the street that hadn't been there before. A dark sedan with tinted windows and someone sitting in the driver's seat. James, do you know who that is? He barely glanced at the car. Probably just someone visiting the neighbors. Are you sure you're ready to be home alone? Emily and I could stay with you for a few days. That's thoughtful, but I'll be fine. What I didn't tell James was that I wouldn't be alone. Nicole had arranged for Detective Rodriguez to have patrol cars drive by regularly, and Harrison Burke was coming over that evening to review Kevin Hayes' trust documents. By tomorrow morning, we'd know exactly what kind of legal trap I was being led into. But as James helped me into the house, and I watched him glance around with the calculating eyes of someone making an inventory, I realized that the legal documents were just one part of the plan. James and Emily weren't just trying to steal my money. They were trying to isolate me, control my environment, and create the perfect conditions for my convenient disappearance. The dark sedan was still parked across the street when James left an hour later. But what James didn't know was that Detective Rodriguez was sitting 3 houses down in an unmarked car taking pictures of everyone who came and went from my property. Because if the Hayes siblings thought they were going to murder me for Ruth's inheritance, they were about to discover that this particular little old lady had some very unexpected allies, and we were all very interested in staying alive long enough to see them arrested. Harrison Burke arrived at 7 o'clock sharp with his reading glasses and his grim expression that told me Kevin Hayes' trust documents were every bit as problematic as I'd suspected. We spread the papers across my dining room table like evidence at a crime scene, which is essentially what they were. Margaret, this isn't estate planning. This is legalized theft with a murder clause thrown in for good measure. Give me the details. The trust is structured so that James gains immediate control of all assets if you're declared incapacitated by any 2 licensed physicians. There's no requirement for independent evaluation, no appeals process, and no oversight once he takes control. Meaning if James can find 2 doctors willing to say you're mentally incompetent, he gets $33 million while you're still breathing. I thought about Kevin Hayes' smooth confidence, about Emily's careful questions regarding my recovery timeline, and about the dark sedan that had been parked across the street for 3 hours. Harrison, is this legal? Unfortunately, yes. It's unethical, predatory, and morally reprehensible, but it's perfectly legal if you sign it voluntarily. My phone rang, and James's name appeared on the screen. I glanced at Harrison, who nodded and pulled out a small recording device. Hi, James. Mom, how are you feeling? Emily and I have been worried about you being alone so soon after the accident. I'm managing fine. A little tired, but fine. That's actually why I'm calling. Emily thinks you seemed confused this afternoon at Kevin's office. You were asking the same questions repeatedly and seemed to have trouble following the conversation. My blood pressure started climbing. I don't recall being confused. Mom, it's nothing to be embarrassed about. Head injuries can affect memory and cognitive function. Emily thinks you should see Dr. Peterson tomorrow for a neurological evaluation. Dr. Peterson. A name I'd never heard before, suggested by Emily Walker Hayes, who happened to be the sister of the lawyer who needed 2 doctors to declare me incompetent. James, I appreciate your concern, but Dr. Martinez is handling my medical care, and she says I'm recovering well. Mom, Dr. Martinez is a trauma physician. Dr. Peterson specializes in brain injuries and cognitive assessment. Emily made an appointment for you at 10 tomorrow morning. Emily had made me a medical appointment without my knowledge or consent. That was either incredibly presumptuous or the opening move in a strategy to have me declared mentally incompetent by Friday. James, I need to think about this. Mom, there's nothing to think about. Emily and I are just looking out for your well-being. We'll pick you up at 9:30. After I hung up, Harrison looked at me with the expression of someone who'd just watched a chess master reveal their strategy. Margaret, they're moving faster than I expected. If Dr. Peterson diagnoses you with cognitive impairment tomorrow, they can file to have you declared incompetent by Friday. James could have legal access to your inheritance by Monday. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Nicole and Detective Rodriguez. They came to my house after dark, using the back entrance to avoid the surveillance I was now certain was being conducted by the Hayes operation. Mrs. Thompson, we've identified the man in the sedan, Detective Rodriguez said, settling into my living room with her notebook. His name is Marcus Webb, and he's a private investigator who's been hired to document your daily activities and mental state. By whom? Officially, by a law firm that specializes in competency hearings. Unofficially, by Kevin Hayes. Nicole leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting months for this conversation. They're building a case file to support Dr. Peterson's diagnosis. Photos of you looking confused, testimony about erratic behavior, evidence that you're unable to care for yourself safely. What kind of evidence? They'll claim you're forgetting to eat, leaving appliances on, getting lost in familiar places. All symptoms of cognitive decline that would justify emergency intervention. Detective Rodriguez opened her folder and showed me a surveillance photo taken through my kitchen window. It showed me standing at the stove this afternoon, looking confused and concerned. This was taken while you were cooking dinner. To someone who doesn't know better, it looks like a woman who's forgotten why she's in the kitchen. But I was actually following Harrison's recipe for pasta sauce and trying to figure out his handwriting. Exactly. But context is everything, and they're controlling the context. Nicole pulled out her own folder. thick with documents and photographs. I've been gathering evidence about Kevin and Emily's previous victims. There have been at least 6 cases in the last 3 years that follow this exact pattern. What happened to the victims? 3 were declared incompetent and died within 6 months of mysterious medical complications. 2 committed suicide after losing control of their assets. 1 disappeared completely. Her body was never found. The room went quiet as the full scope of what I was dealing with sank in. This wasn't just a greedy son and his manipulative wife. This was a professional operation that had killed at least 6 people for their inheritance money. Detective Rodriguez, why haven't they been arrested? Because they're very good at what they do. They choose victims carefully, isolated older adults with large estates and children who are desperate for money. By the time the pattern becomes clear, the victims are either dead or legally powerless to fight back. What makes you think this time will be different? Because you called for help before you signed the trust documents. And because we have Nicole's inside information about their methods. She leaned forward with the kind of intensity that told me we were approaching the crucial part of the plan. Mrs. Thompson, we want to offer you the chance to go undercover. Undercover? Wear a recording device to tomorrow's medical appointment. Let Dr. Peterson examine you, but document everything he says and does. If we can prove that he's been coached to diagnose you with cognitive impairment, regardless of your actual condition, we can build a case for conspiracy and fraud. Nicole added, I'll be working at the medical office tomorrow as a temporary nurse. I can provide backup documentation and witness testimony. I looked at these 2 women who were asking me to risk my life to stop a family of killers, and I realized that this was exactly the kind of choice that defined who you really were when everything was on the line. What are the risks? If they figure out what we're doing, they might accelerate their timeline, Detective Rodriguez said honestly. Instead of waiting for a competency hearing, they might arrange an accident. And if we do nothing, you'll be declared incompetent by Friday, and you'll be dead within 6 months. I thought about Ruth's letter, about her warning that James had his grandfather's greed, about her hope that I would protect what she'd built. I thought about the other victims who died alone and powerless while their families celebrated unexpected windfalls. But mostly, I thought about the fact that I was 66 years old and tired of being underestimated by people who thought maternal love made me stupid. Detective Rodriguez, when do we start? Wednesday night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house settling, every car passing on the street, every shadow moving past my bedroom window felt like the opening note of my murder. By morning, I'd consumed enough coffee to power a small city and had checked the recording device Nicole had given me at least 50 times. At 9:30 sharp, James and Emily arrived to drive me to my appointment with Dr. Peterson. Emily was dressed like a concerned daughter-in-law in a navy dress that suggested both respectability and mourning, while James wore the kind of false concern that actors use in community theater productions. "Mom, you look tired. Did you sleep well?" James asked as he helped me into their car. "About as well as anyone can sleep when they're worried about their mental health." Emily turned around from the passenger seat with what I was now trained to recognize as calculated sympathy. "Margaret, there's nothing to worry about. Dr. Peterson is just going to do some simple tests to make sure the accident didn't affect your cognitive function." "What kind of tests?" "Memory exercises, basic problem solving, questions about current events, just routine evaluation after a head injury." The medical office was located in a professional building that looked expensive and legitimate. Exactly the kind of place where you'd trust a doctor to tell you the truth about your mental condition. Dr. Peterson himself was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of bedside manner that probably reassured families right before he destroyed their lives. "Mrs. Thompson, please have a seat. I understand you've recently experienced a serious automobile accident?" "Yes, about 2 weeks ago." "And you've been experiencing some confusion, memory problems, difficulty following conversations?" I glanced at Emily, who was sitting in the corner taking notes like a devoted family member, documenting my decline. "I haven't noticed any significant problems." "Well, that's actually quite common with traumatic brain injuries. Often the patient isn't aware of their cognitive deficits. That's why family members like Emily are so important in these evaluations." He spent the next 30 minutes putting me through what appeared to be legitimate cognitive testing, remembering word lists, solving simple math problems, identifying pictures and shapes. I performed normally on every test, while the recording device Nicole had hidden in my purse documented everything. Mrs. Thompson, let me ask you about your daily routine. Are you managing your household tasks effectively? Cooking? Cleaning? Paying bills? I think so, yes. Dr. Peterson made notes on his chart, then looked at Emily with what seemed like significance. Emily, have you noticed any changes in Margaret's ability to handle daily responsibilities? And here it came, the family testimony that would justify his predetermined diagnosis. Actually, yes, Emily said with the perfect combination of sadness and concern. Yesterday, when we visited her house, the stove was left on with no pot or pan on it. There were bills scattered around the dining room table like she'd started paying them but forgot what she was doing. And she asked James the same question about her appointment time 3 different times. Every word was a lie. But Dr. Peterson was writing it all down as if Emily were a credible witness instead of a professional predator. Has she shown any signs of paranoid thinking or unusual suspicions about family members? Emily and James exchanged meaningful glances. She's been making some strange accusations about people watching her house and questioning our motives for helping her with financial planning, James said. That's quite common with cognitive decline. Patients often develop paranoid ideation and become suspicious of the people closest to them. Dr. Peterson turned back to me with the kind of gentle authority that probably made families feel grateful for his expertise. Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to recommend some additional testing. Nothing invasive, just some brain scans to help us understand how the accident has affected your cognitive function. Is that necessary? I'm afraid it is. Based on my examination and your family's observations, I'm seeing signs of traumatic brain injury with associated cognitive impairment. We need to determine the extent of the damage so we can discuss appropriate care options. Appropriate care options. That was medical speak for having me declared incompetent and placing me under James's financial control. What kind of care options? Well, that would depend on the test results. But given what I'm seeing today, I think we need to consider whether you're still capable of making important decisions independently. Emily leaned forward with her concerned daughter-in-law expression. Dr. Peterson, Margaret has significant financial responsibilities that she might not be able to handle safely in her current condition. That's exactly the kind of situation where family intervention becomes necessary, Dr. Peterson agreed. We can't allow someone with cognitive impairment to make financial decisions that could be harmful to themselves or their loved ones. After the appointment, as James drove me home, I listened to them discuss my future as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away. Dr. Peterson seems very knowledgeable, Emily said. What did you think about his recommendations? I think Mom needs more help than she's willing to admit, James replied. The brain scans will give us the documentation we need to move forward with Kevin's trust arrangement. Documentation they needed. Not medical care that I needed, but legal evidence they could use to steal $33 million. When can we schedule the brain scans? Kevin said Dr. Peterson can expedite everything if we explain the urgency. We could have results by Friday. That evening, I met with Nicole and Detective Rodriguez to review the recording. What we'd captured was even more damning than I'd expected. Mrs. Thompson, this is textbook medical fraud, Detective Rodriguez said after listening to the entire appointment. Dr. Peterson diagnosed you with cognitive impairment before he even conducted the examination. The questions he asked Emily were leading, designed to elicit specific responses that would support a predetermined conclusion. Nicole had her own evidence to add. I was in the office all day as the temporary nurse. Dr. Peterson met with Kevin Hayes for an hour before your appointment. They reviewed what diagnosis Kevin needed and discussed how to document it properly. What's the next step? Tomorrow, Dr. Peterson will call with your test results and recommend immediate intervention. Kevin Hayes will file emergency competency papers with the court. James will sign the trust documents as your legal guardian, and you'll be placed in a care facility for your own protection. And then, within 6 months, you'll die of medical complications that are perfectly explainable for someone with traumatic brain injury. Detective Rodriguez opened her laptop and showed me a timeline she'd constructed. Kevin Hayes' previous victims all followed this exact pattern. Medical diagnosis, competency hearing, financial transfer, convenient death. I stared at the screen, looking at the names and photos of 6 people who died because they'd trusted their families to protect them instead of steal from them. Detective Rodriguez, Do we have enough evidence to arrest them? We're close, but we need one more piece. We need to catch them in the act of filing false medical reports or perjuring themselves in court. How do we do that? She smiled with the kind of satisfaction that told me we were about to turn the tables on people who thought they were smarter than the law. Tomorrow morning, you're going to surprise everyone by showing up to Kevin Hayes' office with your own attorney and your own medical expert. We're going to force them to commit perjury in front of witnesses, and then we're going to watch their entire operation collapse. But first, I was going to call James and Emily and tell them exactly what I thought of their plan to murder me for money. Because if I was going down swinging. And I was going to make sure they understood exactly who they'd tried to manipulate. After 66 years on this planet, it was time to show my family what happened when you mistook a mother's love for a mother's weakness. Thursday morning at 9:15, I walked into Kevin Hayes' office with Harrison Burke, Dr. Elizabeth Chen from the State Medical Board, Detective Rodriguez, and a court reporter. The look on Kevin's face when our little parade entered his expensive office was worth the risk of everything I was about to do. Mrs. Thompson, what's going on here? Kevin, I thought we should discuss your trust documents with some additional experts present. James and Emily were already seated at Kevin's conference table, surrounded by legal papers and wearing matching expressions of predatory satisfaction that transformed into panic as they realized their meeting had been crashed by law enforcement. Mom, what are all these people doing here? James stood up, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and what I was beginning to recognize as the fear of someone whose criminal scheme was imploding. James, I'd like you to meet Dr. Elizabeth Chen. She's here to discuss the medical evaluation that Dr. Peterson performed yesterday. Dr. Chen stepped forward with the kind of professional authority that made Kevin Hayes back up against his desk. Mr. Thompson, I've reviewed the medical report that Dr. Peterson filed with the court this morning, recommending your mother's immediate competency hearing. Emily went very still. Filed this morning? But the brain scans aren't scheduled until this afternoon. Interesting point, Dr. Chen replied, because according to Dr. Peterson's report, the brain scans have already been completed and show evidence of severe cognitive impairment requiring immediate intervention. Kevin Hayes cleared his throat nervously. I'm sure there's been some administrative error. Dr. Peterson probably misstated his report. Detective Rodriguez opened her folder and spread several documents across Kevin's conference table. Actually, Mr. Hayes, the dates are perfectly accurate. Dr. Peterson filed a medical report diagnosing Mrs. Thompson with severe dementia based on brain scans that were allegedly performed last Friday. That's impossible, James said. Mom was still in the hospital last Friday. Exactly, which means Dr. Peterson filed a report based on medical tests that never happened, diagnosing a patient he had never examined, for a condition that doesn't exist. The room went silent, except for the soft clicking of the court reporter's machine, documenting every word. Harrison Burke pulled out his own folder and began reading. According to the competency petition filed with the court 2 hours ago, Mrs. Thompson is suffering from severe dementia, poses a danger to herself and others, and requires immediate placement under her son's financial guardianship to protect her $33 million inheritance. Emily and James exchanged glances like prisoners who just heard their death sentence. Furthermore, Detective Rodriguez continued, we have recordings of yesterday's medical appointment showing Dr. Peterson's examination was conducted specifically to create documentation for a predetermined diagnosis. I stood up slowly, letting my voice carry the full weight of 66 years' worth of disappointment in people who'd mistaken kindness for stupidity. James, I know about the Hayes siblings' previous victims. I know about the 6 people they've killed for inheritance money. And I know that you married Emily specifically to get access to Ruth's estate. Mom, you're being paranoid. Emily and I love each other. Emily, tell James about your real name. Emily's composure finally cracked completely. I don't know what you're talking about. Your real name is Emily Hayes, and Kevin is your brother. You're both professional inheritance thieves, and James is just your latest mark. James turned to look at Emily with an expression of dawning horror. Emily, is that true? Emily's silence was answer enough. Kevin Hayes made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. Detective Rodriguez, I think there are some misunderstandings here that we can clear up without involving law enforcement. Actually, Mr. Hayes, we're past the point of misunderstandings. You filed false medical documents with the court. Your sister committed marriage fraud, and you've both been conducting surveillance on Mrs. Thompson without her consent. That's enough for arrests right now. She nodded to two uniformed officers who'd been waiting outside, and they entered the office with handcuffs. Kevin Hayes, Emily Hayes, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and filing false medical reports. As the officers began reading them their rights, Emily turned to James with the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her. James, I want you to know that none of this was supposed to hurt you. You were supposed to be our partner in this. James stared at her like a man who just discovered that his entire reality was a carefully constructed lie. Partner in what? In killing your mother for her money. The words hung in the air like poison gas, and I watched my son's face as he finally understood the full scope of what he'd been drawn into. He hadn't just been greedy and selfish. He'd been the unknowing accomplice in a plan to murder his mother. Mom, he whispered, and for the first time in years, his voice sounded like the little boy who'd once come to me with scraped knees and broken toys. James, we'll talk about this later. Right now, I need you to understand that you have a choice to make. What choice? You can continue to be the kind of man who throws his mother away for money. Or you can become the kind of man who admits he was wrong and tries to make it right. Detective Rodriguez stepped forward with her final piece of evidence. Mr. Thompson, we have documentation that you were in contact with Kevin Hayes 3 weeks before your aunt's death was publicly announced. We have recordings of your medical appointment yesterday where you lied about your mother's mental condition. And we have surveillance footage of you casing your mother's house for security vulnerabilities. James looked around the room like a man who just realized he was standing in quicksand. Detective Rodriguez, I swear I didn't know they were planning to hurt her. I thought we were just trying to protect the inheritance from taxes and legal complications. That's exactly what they wanted you to think. But your choices over the next few hours will determine whether you're charged as a victim of their scheme or as a co-conspirator in attempted murder. After Kevin and Emily were led away in handcuffs, James and I sat alone in Kevin's office while Harrison Burke handled the paperwork that would undo all the legal documents they'd tried to trap me with. Mom, I'm sorry. For what, specifically? For being a terrible son, for being greedy, for letting them use me to hurt you. I looked at this man who'd been my greatest pride and my deepest disappointment, and I realized that this was the moment that would define our relationship for whatever time we had left. James, I forgive you for being greedy. I forgive you for being selfish. I even forgive you for not visiting me in the hospital. But I will never forgive you for being willing to steal from me without even having the courage to do it yourself. You hid behind Emily and Kevin because you wanted my money, but you didn't want to take responsibility for taking it. James was crying now, the kind of tears that come from finally seeing yourself clearly and not liking what you find. What can I do to fix this? You can start by testifying against the Hayes siblings. You can help us make sure they never do this to another family. And then, I thought about Ruth's letter, about her hope that I would protect what she'd built, about the responsibility that came with $33 million and a second chance at life. Then you can prove that you've learned the difference between being given something and earning it. 6 months later, I was sitting in the federal courthouse watching Kevin and Emily Hayes receive life sentences for 6 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. James sat beside me, wearing a suit that had belonged to his father and an expression of someone who'd spent half a year learning what it meant to face the consequences of your choices. The prosecutor, Maria Santos, had built an airtight case using the evidence we'd gathered, plus testimony from James about the Hayes siblings' methods. It turned out that Kevin and Emily had been running their inheritance scheme for 5 years, targeting lonely widows and elderly parents whose adult children were desperate enough to participate in murder for money. Your Honor, Prosecutor Santos said during her closing statement, the defendants didn't just steal money from their victims. They stole dignity, trust, and the fundamental safety that families are supposed to provide for their most vulnerable members. Kevin Hayes showed no remorse during his sentencing. Even facing life in prison, he maintained the arrogant confidence of someone who believed he was smarter than everyone else in the room. Emily, on the other hand, broke down completely when the judge read her sentence, finally showing genuine emotion after months of calculated performance. James had testified against them with the kind of detailed honesty that comes from someone who's finally decided to stop lying to himself. His testimony had been devastating, not just legally but personally, as he described how they'd manipulated his greed and resentment into a willingness to betray his mother. The hardest part, he'd said from the witness stand, was realizing that I'd been angry at my mother for not giving me the life I thought I deserved when I'd never actually earned anything for myself. After the sentencing, James and I walked out of the courthouse together, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was walking with my son instead of dragging him along behind me. "Mom, what happens now?" "Now we figure out what we're going to do with the rest of our lives." Over the past 6 months, James had been living in a modest apartment and working as a construction supervisor, the first honest job he'd held for more than a year. He'd also been attending therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez, trying to understand how 35 years of entitlement had nearly turned him into an accomplice to murder. "I've been thinking about what you said about earning things versus being given them. And I want to earn your respect back. I want to become someone you can be proud of again." I looked at my son, 42 years old, and finally asking the right questions, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope for his future. "James, I have a proposition for you." We drove to the offices of Riverside Community Foundation, a nonprofit organization I'd been researching for months. Ruth's $33 million was more money than any one person needed, and I'd been thinking about how to use it in a way that would honor her memory while protecting other families from predators like the Hayes siblings. "Mrs. Thompson," said Maria Gonzalez, the foundation's director, "we're honored that you're considering establishing a fund with us." I'd decided to create the Ruth Sullivan Memorial Fund for Elder Protection, a foundation that would provide legal services for older adults facing financial abuse, support for families dealing with inheritance fraud, and education programs to help people recognize the signs of estate planning scams. "James is going to help me run it," I said, watching his face as he realized what I was offering him. "Mom, are you serious?" "I'm serious about giving you the chance to prove you've changed. The foundation will pay you a modest salary for honest work protecting people from the kind of criminals you almost became." James was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing what this meant, not just financially, but morally. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I mess this up too?" "Then you'll learn from your mistakes and try again. But James, this time you'll be working to help people instead of hurt them." The Ruth Sullivan Memorial Fund launched 3 months later with an initial endowment of $25 million. I kept $8 million for my own retirement and independence because I'd learned that having your own resources was the best protection against people who might mistake your generosity for vulnerability. James threw himself into the work with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. He coordinated with law enforcement agencies, developed educational materials, and personally counseled families who'd been targeted by inheritance scams. It turned out that his experience as an almost victim made him uniquely qualified to help other people recognize manipulation before it was too late. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Rodriguez said during one of our quarterly advisory board meetings, "the foundation has helped us prevent 17 inheritance fraud cases in the past 6 months. That's 17 families who still have their parents and their dignity." I looked around the conference table at the attorneys, social workers, and law enforcement officers who'd committed to protecting older adults from financial predators. And I felt the kind of satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful instead of just accumulating wealth. But the most meaningful change was in my relationship with James. Not because he'd become perfect, he was still learning how to be an adult at 42, but because he'd finally taken responsibility for his choices and was working to become someone worthy of trust. "Mom," he said one evening as we reviewed foundation applications, "do you think Dad would be proud of what we're doing?" I thought about my late husband, about the man who'd loved James despite his flaws and worried about his character. "I think Dad would be proud that you finally figured out how to use your intelligence for something other than taking shortcuts. And you? Are you proud of me?" It was a question he'd been asking in various ways since his testimony against the Hayes siblings, and finally, I could answer it honestly. "James, I'm proud of who you're becoming, and that's enough for now." 6 months ago, I'd inherited $33 million and nearly lost my life to my own son's greed. Today, I was sitting in my own foundation's office, watching James coordinate with federal agents to shut down another inheritance fraud scheme, and feeling the kind of contentment that comes from surviving your worst nightmare and building something better from the wreckage. Ruth had been right about one thing. James had needed to learn that success wasn't something that happened to other people. He'd just needed to learn it the hard way, in a federal courthouse, facing the consequences of almost becoming a killer for money. But she'd been wrong about something else. She'd underestimated both of us. I wasn't just the woman who'd never asked her for anything. I was the woman who'd fought back when everything was on the line. And James wasn't just the greedy grandson she'd worried about. He was the man who'd found the courage to testify against his co-conspirators and spend the rest of his life protecting the people he'd almost helped destroy. As I locked up the foundation office that evening and watched James drive away to his modest apartment in his practical Honda, I realized that some inheritances aren't about money at all. They're about wisdom, courage, and the strength to become better than the people who raised you thought you could be. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they're about second chances, for both mothers and sons who finally figured out what really matters when everything else is stripped away. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.